You know, back in the 80s and 90s, there was this Pakistani TV show, a drama, that Uyghurs were just captivated by.
Oh, I think I know the one you mean.
Mir Aksar, The Inheritor.
Right.
And it wasn't just like good TV with drama and dilemmas. It really struck a chord, a deep one.
Right.
And you have to ask why, right? Well, it's because Mira's inheritance has always been so much more than just, property or money for ogres.
These deeply significant.
Exactly. It's like the sacred trust. It's all tied up with Islamic law, yeah, but also these really old customs, the values passed down.
Uh-huh.
So these questions, who gets what? What's actually fair? What gets left behind or forgotten?
Yeah.
They're not just legal details. They feel, well, emotional, spiritual even.
Absolutely. There's a real weight to it.
So that's what we're doing in this deep dive. We're going to explore this whole idea, this really complex concept of inheritance, Mir Hakira among ogres. We'll look at it from, history, customs, religion, how it all interacts today.
Yeah, try and get to the heart of it.
Our mission, basically, is to unpack the key ideas, the principles, the nuances around miras.
Sounds good. And it's true. When you first hear inheritance, you probably think, okay, property and belongings left by the deceased. Simple enough.
Right, the stuff.
Yeah, the stuff. But our sources, they remind us heritage is actually much bigger. It can be knowledge like scientific knowledge, cultural ways of doing things, even skills,
Like crafts passed down.
Exactly. Now, today, we're going to focus mostly on the material side, the tangible things, but it's good to keep that bigger picture, that wider sense of heritage in the back of our minds as we talk about Maris.
Okay, got it. So let's unpack this a bit. I mean, where did this whole idea of needing rules for inheritance even start? Why couldn't people just figure it out?
Well, it seems to be really closely linked to the idea of private property itself. As society started having, surplus goods, things people owned individually or as families.
Right, not just communal stuff.
Exactly. The question just naturally pops up. What happens to all this when someone dies? So early communities, they needed some kind of structure, maybe informal at first, but ways to handle passing things on within the group.
So it wasn't just a free-for-all from day one. There were sort of unwritten rules, maybe, within families or tribes.
That's the idea. Initially, it was really embedded in kinship systems. It was often about keeping the family unit going, keeping its resources intact.
Makes sense.
And then, as cultures got more complex, their specific customs and rules around inheritance did too. They tended to reflect the core values of that culture, what they thought was fair, basically.
And for Uyghurs, this has been important for a long time.
Oh, yeah. The sources really stress this. Property, crafts, even like the family profession, these were all seen as heritage, something to be passed down.
Well,
And it was supported by what the sources call these noble ethical customs.
noble ethical customs, huh?
Yeah. And what's really interesting is we find early written stuff, like actual recommendations, wills, which tells us people were thinking about this, documenting it pretty early on.
Wow. Okay, now this is where it gets really layered, right? The religion part. We know Uyghurs had their own customs before Islam. How did that shift things?
Yeah, that's a fascinating intersection. So you had customary law governing inheritance practices first. But then, with the adoption of monotheistic beliefs, especially Islam, the religious rulings started to merge with those customs.
So it wasn't like Islam just wiped the slate clean.
Not really, no. It was more like an enrichment, sometimes a significant change, but often building on or blending with what was there. You get this kind of fusion shaping mirrors.
Can you give an example, something specific that changed because of Islamic influence?
Yeah, there's a really clear one the sources mention, inheritance marriage.
Inheritance marriage. What's that?
Well, historical texts, like the history of northern dynasties, talk about a custom among some Turkic groups, where if a father or older brother died, the son or younger brother might marry the widow, the stepmother or sister-in-law.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But when Uyghurs adopted Islam, this practice stopped. It directly contradicted rulings in the Quran that forbid those kinds of marriages. So that wasn't just tweaking a rule, it was a fundamental change in family structure and norms.
That really shows the power of religious values to reshape culture. So how deeply did Islamic law take root in inheritance? Was it the main thing for a long time?
The sources suggest, yeah, pretty strongly, from the time Islam was widely adopted right up until 1985 when the state introduced its own inheritance law.
1985.
Before that, Islamic rules were largely the standard. But now, today, it's more complex. You've got this interplay happening between the old customs that still linger, the established religious rulings, and this newer state law.
So they all kind of bump up against each other.
Yeah, they influence each other, they adapt, sometimes they complement each other, sometimes one might override the others, especially, as the economy changes and how people value things shifts.
Right. Okay, and you mentioned earlier, just to be super clear, the difference between material and immaterial inheritance. Can you just quickly recap that?
Sure. Material inheritance is the tangible stuff, property, money, objects, land. Immaterial is the non-physical,
Mm,
knowledge, traditions, values, language, skills, that sort of thing.
got it. And we're focusing mainly on the material side today, the mirrors aspect.
Exactly. Though the immaterial is fascinating too, just maybe for another time.
Okay, so we know it has deep roots, history, religion, but what about actual proof? Like hard evidence from way back showing how Uyghurs handled inheritance.
We do have some really good evidence. Finding wills and actual inheritance division documents in Turpan is huge.
Hmm.
These date back to the Itakut Uyghur Khanate period, roughly 9th to 14th centuries.
That far back, wow.
Yeah. And these documents, they show a pretty well-established system. People were writing wills, specifying who gets what. It suggests a fairly organized approach, not just casual arrangements.
That's amazing. Formal legal documents about inheritance from like 1,000 years ago. Was it only in these kinds of formal records or did it pop up elsewhere?
No, it pops up elsewhere too. Mahmud al-Kashgari's famous dictionary, Divanu Lugat Turk, from the 11th century, it includes the word kumaru, and it defines it as both inheritance and also a keepsake, specifically like a special item that was given to the Khan when an elder died.
Interesting. So inheritance, but also maybe symbolic items too.
Exactly. It hints at both the practical and maybe the symbolic side. And another big text from that era, Kutadgu Bilig, uses a slightly different spelling, kumaru, but with a similar meaning. So, okay, slight spelling difference, but the concept was definitely there and important enough to be recorded in major works.
Okay, so we've got the history, the laws, but what about the sort of everyday customs, the ethics around it? Feels like there's more going on than just dividing assets according to rules.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really crucial part of Maris. There are these deeply held customs and ethical ideas that really guide how people behave.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, there's a very strong, social taboo against dividing up the inheritance too quickly after someone dies. Specifically, before the 40-day mourning period is over.
40 days. Okay.
Yeah. Doing it sooner is seen as really disrespectful. People will talk. There's even a saying, something like, they barely stood up for mourning and they're already fighting, squabbling before their parents' heads even touch the ground.
Wow, that paints a picture. Really shows that respect for the deceased comes first.
Definitely. It highlights that emotional, respectful dimension. And there are other customs, too. Like in some families, it's traditional for the youngest son to inherit the family home.
The youngest son.
The idea often expressed is, we won't extinguish our parents' candle. It's symbolic, like keeping the family hearth alive, maintaining that connection to the home and the parents.
That's quite beautiful, actually.
It is. And you also hear about cases where older siblings might choose to give up their share or part of it to help younger siblings who maybe need it more. It shows this strong sense of family duty.
And this idea of halal inheritance, legitimate inheritance, that seems central too.
Absolutely vital. Huge emphasis on making sure everything is halal, done lawfully and ethically according to Islamic principles.
So what does that mean in practice?
Well, it includes things like making absolutely sure all the deceased person's debts are paid off before the inheritance is distributed.
Okay, clear the debts first.
Right. And sometimes paying zakat, the religious charity obligation, on the inherited wealth before it's divided up. And remember that public announcement during the funeral prayer.
Where the imam asks about debts or harm caused.
Exactly. That serves as a kind of public moral guarantee for creditors. Even if there's no formal paperwork, the community is witness, and there's an obligation to settle things. It reinforces that ethical foundation.
What about when the heirs are kids? You know, too young to handle property or money.
Yeah, that's where the role of a guardian, or wazi, comes in.
Hmm.
If someone dies leaving underage children, a trusted person, maybe a relative, a respected neighbor, is appointed as their guardian.
So they manage things.
Exactly. They look after the children's well-being, and they manage the inherited property for them until the children reach the legal age to handle it themselves. It's also a custom for parents who know they're seriously ill to actually name someone they trust for this role beforehand.
That makes sense, planning ahead. It really sounds like inherited things, items that carry more than just monetary value. There's a lot of feeling attached.
Oh, definitely. You often hear children talk about inherited items with real emotion. this was my mother's, or this came from my father. They're treated as precious links to their parents, to their family history.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's even a proverb. Even if it's from inheritance, take it as if it were a gift. It emphasizes gratitude, seeing the inherited item as something special, not just something you're owed.
That's a nice way to put it. And this extends beyond just personal things, right? You mentioned crafts earlier.
Yes, the inheritance of trades and skills is really significant. It's a strong tradition for a son to learn and continue his father's craft. It's seen as a valuable part of the inheritance.
So they pass down the know-how?
The know-how, the tools, maybe even old manuals or notebooks, related to the craft. They preserve it carefully. The saying goes, the father's craft is inherited by the son. It captures that idea perfectly.
Is there a belief tied to that? Like, is it considered good luck to continue the craft?
Yeah, there's a strong belief that keeping up the inherited craft brings prosperity, barakat, blessings, and conversely, that abandoning it might lead to hardship. There's also this interesting cultural idea that household items used by the parents, if inherited and used with care, have special qualities, almost like they carry the parents' spirit of protection.
So, okay, when it actually comes time to divide everything up, how does that usually happen? What's the process?
Well, the sources outline two main paths. First, if the deceased left a will, either written down or maybe stated clearly in front of witnesses, that's usually followed.
And people check for a will.
Yes, often neighborhood elders take on the role of asking around, checking with family and the community if there was a known will, written or verbal.
And if there's no will?
Then the division generally follows the rules laid out in Islamic Sharia law.
Okay.
But regardless of which method, there's a very strong moral and religious condemnation if someone tries to unfairly grab more than their rightful share. Describing it as taking the orphan's rightful share really shows how seriously wrong that's considered.
Right, that phrase carries a lot of weight. Are there specific customs about who gets what particular items? Is it just split evenly?
Not always evenly, especially with personal items. Things that were used by the whole family, sort of giant household items, those are typically shared among all the children. But for things that were more personal to the parents, there's often a gender-specific custom. So items linked mainly to the father, maybe tools, his specific knife, things like that, often go to the sons.
And the mother's things.
Things like her jewelry, maybe wedding rings, clothes, those typically go to the daughters. It's a customary division.
Interesting.
And another really common practice considered very good is to take some of the inherited belongings, especially clothes, and give them away as charity sadaqah to orphans or needy people. The idea is that this act benefits the soul of the person who passed away.
That's a lovely tradition. Now, what about the overall shares, the proportions? We often hear that in Islamic inheritance, sons get more than daughters. How does that work here?
Yes, the general rule, based on Islamic guidelines, is that sons typically inherit double the share of daughters.
Okay.
And a surviving spouse usually gets a specific fraction, either a quarter or an eighth, depending on whether the deceased left children or not.
But are there situations where it's different? Exceptions.
Oh, yes, definitely. For instance, if someone passes away and only has daughters, no sons, then the daughters usually inherit the property equally among themselves.
Ah, okay.
And if there are no children at all, but maybe other close relatives like parents or siblings and a spouse, then the inheritance is divided between them according to specific shares set out in the law.
What about, say, step-siblings or children born outside marriage?
The rules do address those situations too. Stepbrothers might inherit under certain conditions, usually if there aren't closer relatives. Illegitimate children might also have some rights in specific circumstances, again, often depending on the absence of closer legal heirs. And if someone dies with absolutely no legal heirs at all,
Yeah.
then the property often goes to community welfare, like supporting local mosques or community projects.
Okay, that covers a lot. What about things given away before death, like gifts or
Yeah.
helping kids who aren't married yet?
Good points. Yeah, property that was already given as a gift during the person's lifetime, or something specifically set aside in a will for someone, that's generally not included in the main pot of inheritance to be divided.
It's already accounted for, basically.
Exactly. And yes, it's quite common and seen as fair to consider the expenses needed for unmarried sons or daughters, things like living costs, wedding expenses. This might mean they receive a slightly larger share to help them get established.
That seems practical and compassionate.
It does. And there's even provision for an unborn child. If a wife is pregnant when her husband dies, the unborn child is considered an heir, assuming they are born alive. A guardian manages their share until then.
Wow, they really seem to have thought through a lot of scenarios over time. You mentioned earlier some shifts related to land. How has that changed?
Yeah, historically, land was a major inheritable asset, typically passing from father to son. That was the norm before things like the abolition of serfdom and the introduction of modern land ownership laws.
So before recent history.
Right. In the older feudal systems, you could even inherit official positions along with land. And some sources mention nobles dividing up their property during their lifetime to try and avoid disputes among their heirs later on.
Smart move, maybe.
Perhaps. You could even see echoes of very old, sort of primitive feudal inheritance customs in epic tales like the Ogu's Name.
And has the type of property that's most important for inheritance changed?
Definitely. If you think about pastoral societies, nomadic groups, the main wealth, the main inheritance would have been livestock and grazing rights, pastures.
Animals, yeah.
But as people settled into farming, then tools, household goods, land itself became more central as inheritable property. The focus shifted with the lifestyle.
It sounds like fairness is a really persistent theme through all of this, even in like folk tales.
Absolutely. It's a
Oh,
very common motif in Uyghur folk stories. You often get the character of the greedy, unfair eldest son who tries to cheat his siblings out of their inheritance. And then there's usually a virtuous younger son, often the youngest, who is honest and fair, and he ends up being rewarded, sometimes with a bit of magical help from the figure Kizer.
so the stories teach a lesson.
Exactly. They act as moral guides, reinforcing that cultural value of fairness and justice and warning against greed, especially when it comes to family inheritance.
So if we try to pull all these threads together, what's the big takeaway about mirrors, about Uyghur inheritance?
I think the main thing is realizing it's not just one thing. It's not just law, not just custom, not just religion. It's this really complex weave of all those things together.
Legal, kinship, ethical, religious, cultural.
Exactly. All tangled up. To really get what mirrors means, you have to see how all those different aspects interact and influence each other. It demands a really comprehensive view.
Which I guess brings us right back to where we started with that TV show, Mirror Score. It makes perfect sense now why it resonated so much. It wasn't just about who got the house or the money. It was tapping into all these deeply, deeply ingrained cultural nerves, the values, the emotions, the whole weight of family legacy.
Yeah, the drama probably felt very real because it reflected those complex dynamics, the sensitivities, the potential for conflict, and the importance of doing things right that are all part of Mira's and Uyghur society.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening as you reflect on this. Think about how inheritance works in cultures you know. How do tradition, religion, modern laws mix together there? What core values seem to be holding strong? And what might be changing or getting challenged as time goes on? Definitely something worth pondering.